This is a production of World Video Bible School. To God be the glory.
Hello and welcome back to this another lesson on learning to use the Greek New Testament. In our previous lesson, you'll remember that we studied the voice, particularly middle and passive, and how to translate that and what that all entails. And remember that when we're talking about voice, we're talking about how the element of the verb is expressed in relationship to the subject of the sentence. In other words, remember that has to do with whether or not the subject of the sentence is performing the action of the verb or is said to be doing the action of the verb, and thereby that verb would be active, or if it's a passive sentence in which the element of that verb is being performed on the subject itself. So the subject is said to be passive in that sense, or the verb is. And so what we want to do today is to continue on with our discussion about the middle and passive in the other tenses. Now, we've talked about the middle and passive in regard to the present tense. Now, what I'd like for us to do in this lesson is sort of combine the next three chapters into one. But as we begin to talk about voice and talk about its importance, especially that of the passive voice, I want you to know that in English, sometimes when you begin to write a sentence in the passive voice, that is usually frowned upon or somewhat frowned upon for a number of reasons. But in Greek, it can be a very, very effective tool in communicating some very important theological truths. So let's talk just a moment about that. Let's consider, first of all, from a book that I have here called The Little Brown Handbook. I've been referring to it from time to time. There's something I want to read to you out of it, and you'll see it on the screen at this time. Notice, from page 253, the text says that in the active voice, the subject acts. For example, I peeled the onions. And there you see the subject of the sentence, I. Peeled is the verb, and the onions then is the object. So the subject is performing the action of that verb, peeling the onions. In the passive voice, the subject is acted upon, and the actor is either reduced to a phrase, and thus you see the example, the onions were peeled by me, or it's omitted entirely, in which case it would be said the onions were peeled. The passive voice is thus indirect, obscuring the actor or bearing him or her entirely. And so you see in that passive voice, the subject of the sentence is said to be obscured somewhat, as opposed to turning it around into an active sentence. Now, how does that have an impact upon Greek? Well, I want to call your attention to another text that I have referred to from time to time, Basics of Biblical Greek, by William D. Mounts. Let's take a look at that quote now from his text. Notice, he says that the biblical writers are so open and direct in speaking of God's actions for us and for our salvation that it may come as a surprise to students of New Testament Greek that sometimes God's sovereign grace is hidden in grammatical expressions that do not contain the name of God at all. This is the case with the construction of Max Zerwick, which has called the theological passive. Jewish reticence about speaking of God directly shows up quite often in Jesus' use of the future passive indicative, perhaps as a kind of understatement for rhetorical effect. There are four classic examples in the Beatitudes where Jesus says of those he pronounces blessed that they will be comforted, Matthew 5:4. They will be filled, 5:6. They will be shown mercy, Matthew 5:7. And they will be called the children of God, 5:9. The meaning is that God will comfort them, fill them, show them mercy, and call them His children. In a promise of answered prayer, Jesus says, ask and it will be given you. Knock and it will be opened. Luke 11 verse 9. Clearly, God is the one who gives and opens the door. The aorist passive is used less often in this way, yet Peter speaks of the prophets to whom it was revealed that is, to whom God revealed, that their prophecies were for us, 1 Peter 1:12. God's sovereignty embraces even the terrible judgments in Revelation, where 4 horsemen were given, edathe, and there is your ending in Greek, you see, for the passive, power to kill by sword, famine, and disease, Revelation 6, verse 8. And John himself was given a reed to measure the temple court for judgment, 11, verse 1. Here too, God is the unexpressed giver. Now notice this last sentence. In Greek, the passive voice is often considered weak style. In English, the passive voice is often considered weak style. But in Greek, it can be a clear signal that God is at work. So, in other words, what Mounce was trying to convey to us, again, is this, that many important theological truths, many important concepts in the Bible are expressed by means of the passive voice to demonstrate that it's not as the person, the subject of the sentence may be, that might be doing something great, but it's been given to us. As the subject of the sentence, God is the one that has given those things to us that we need, that we could not provide for ourselves. Even in the book of Revelation, He provided things whereby His providential care and love could be exercised and whereby His will could be made known, even in a situation that brought judgments upon people. And so those are some examples and some quotes that might emphasize to you the importance of the passive voice and recognizing that as you study through the Greek New Testament. All right, well, let's take a look at the rest of the passive forms in the indicative mood. And in so doing, I want us to cover the next 3 chapters of David Black's textbook. And we simply want to preview it. We're not going to discuss it all in detail and go over all the nuances or all the little elements of what happens when letters contract and some of the rules as far as forming the stems and what happens to those stems when their endings come on them. And so we are simply just going to preview them at this time, discuss their grammatical forms, and highlight a few of the chapter's important points. And then we'll work a few sentences in our next session together. Now, in our lesson before, we introduced the middle and passive in the present. Now, here they are, masai tai, metha sthe entai. Remember, first, second, and third person singular, first, second, and third person plural in the right-hand column. Now, just by way of remembrance, remember that on the second person singular, where it says psi there, that in the present, the actual ending is going to be an eta with an iota subscript, and we'll talk a little bit more again about why that's the case. But nevertheless, remember, these are the endings, masai tai, metha sthe entai, that really then form the endings for those verbs, whereby you can know in the present that a particular verb, for example, if you put luomai on there, then you would know that that means I am loosed, and that the person, the subject of the sentence, is the one being loosed. So remember, we talked about that in the previous lesson. All right, well, what about the other forms for the present or for the middle and passive endings in the other tenses? Let's go to the board now and have here before us a chart that you can see that we have referred to from time to time, although it hasn't been quite this extensive to this point. But nevertheless, I've written up here most of the tenses. We don't have the pluperfect tense, and then I did not include upon here the second aorist, which basically is the same as far as the time is concerned and the aspect, but the forms are a little bit different. They take on, remember, the imperfect endings, and you know that it's an aorist by its stem changer. But nevertheless, we want to focus now our attention upon the fact that as you look at this chart, you will remember that these are our tenses, perfect, present, and future, and those are what we call the primary tenses. And that with each tense we have voice, active, middle, and passive. And to this point, remember, we had already learned the active voice endings, o, es, a, amen, ete, usen. Okay, first person, second person, third person singular, first person, second person, third person plural. Now, what are the endings for the present? Middle and passive, well, we've learned them. My, psi, we're going to go ahead and just remember that as psi, even though it's an eta. Tai, methus, they, entai. Okay? And now it's the same thing for the passive, the same endings. And I, on this one, put our connecting vowel. Remember that we said many lessons ago that you have a stem, and then you have that variable vowel, as it's called, either epsilon or an omicron, that some people call a connecting vowel, between that and the actual ending. And so some people will say, oh my, etai, ometha, este, antai. But sometimes it's just easier to say my, psi, tai, metha, se, entai, you see. And so anyway, I put those on here just so you would know that technically it's not a part of the ending, although if you went over here in the active voice, we have placed it on, prefixed it onto each of these endings here just so that it's a little easier to pronounce. What happened here with the omicron is that basically it was lengthened, and so technically in the active voice you don't have really an ending per se, okay? But we do learn it that way just because it's easier. All right, so we've learned our middle and passive endings for the present. You'll notice down here on this chart that I have, in using the stem lu for loose, that we have given an example of how each of these are to be translated. In the active voice, I am loosing. In the middle, I am loosing for myself, or action done to myself or for myself, for the benefit of myself. And then the passive, I am being loose. All right, the action of this verb being performed backed upon the subject of the sentence. Okay, well, what about in the perfect tense? If we went to the perfect tense, what are the endings for the middle and the passive? Well, thankfully, they're the same as those in the present. We don't have to remember anything else, my, psi, tai, methus, they, entai, except in the second person singular, we have that psi here as opposed to the present over here that just has the eta. And essentially what has happened, if I could get a pen here for just a moment, is that when we go to the perfect, we have, in this particular instance, just the psi ending. But when we go over here to the present, what ends up happening is the sigma drops out. According to the rule, the sigma is going to drop out here, and that leaves us with an alpha and a iota, and so according to the rule, the alpha gets lengthened into an eta, okay? And so this iota right here basically runs back underneath the eta, so you can technically see it still there, all right? So you just have to sort of by memory come to know that that eta in that second person singular is this psi that we're talking about here. So my, psi, tai, methus, they, entai. And of course you'll want to remember as well that when you think about the difference between the perfect and the present, how you're going to know the difference between the middle and passive perfect and the middle and passive present is that we're going to have our time morph on here and the reduplication, you remember, for the perfect, okay? And so just remember that those prefixed morphemes that we've discussed in previous lessons will be on there, and that right away will key you into its perfect, the fact that it's perfect. And then you'll just notice that it's either middle or passive, and you'll have to know that it's either middle or passive, as we said before, by the context. The context of the sentence as you're translating it will make it clear, because usually when it is passive you won't have or when it is middle you won't have an object. It'll become clear that it ought to be translated as middle, that it's coming back upon the subject itself. And just by way of remembrance, here is our perfect endings in the active voice: ka, kas, ken, kamen, kate, kan. Okay? So now let's go to the imperfect and notice the forms for the middle and passive of the imperfect. And we're coming back now to what are known as the secondary tenses. And I didn't put up the pluperfect up there because it is so rare. We have talked about it in the past, and I thought just for the sake of our discussion here, we're just going to focus on these tenses here. So amen, u, eta, ametha, este, anta. Okay? Amen, u, eta, ametha, este, anta. And again, thankfully, we don't have to remember anything else for the passive. They're the same forms as you can see. And again, the context will bear it out as to how it should be, whether or not it's middle or it's passive. Okay, so in some tenses, the middle and passive are the same. In other tenses, they're going to be different, and we're going to show you that now as we move to the aorist tense. Okay, remember that the aorist tense is simple past action. Aorist tense is simple past action. Just he loosed, she loosed, they loosed, I loosed. Okay, with no comment one way or another as to the linear nature of it. It may be linear action, but again, there's no comment from the writer's perspective as to the linear nature of it or lack thereof. It's undefined is literally what aorist means. In the imperfect, ongoing action in the past. Well, what about the endings for the middle and passive? Okay, for our middle, samein, okay, so, sata, sametha, saste, santa. Now you can begin to see some patterns emerging here. Okay, if we went back up here to the aorist, samein, amen, that sounds a whole lot like, if we go over now to the imperfect, for the middle and passive, amen. You say, well, how do I know the difference? Remember, here is our past time morpheme, saw, saw. When I hear that saw sound, remember, saw, saw, se, samen, sate, san. And I hear that morpheme in there, that saw sound, then I know I've got a past time, plus I would have prefixed our other past time morpheme there, prefixed to the stem. So elusa, it would be epsilon, and then lambda, upsilon, sa, elusa, I loosed. Okay, but here it would be elusa main, and it would be eluso, elusata. Okay, so those are the middle voices. So it becomes quite clear then how that's to be translated, because these are different from these forms in the passive. Now, I want you to notice something here very carefully. When we go to the passive, this thane, thase, thay, thamen, thete, thesan. Hear that thay. Here is our morpheme, thay. We're going to run across again in other in other situations in the future, as well as when we move to participles. We're going to need to pay attention to that thay, 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 thay. That's telling me passive, passive, passive. So pay attention to that. So know this, thane, thase, thay, thamen, thete, thesan. And again, you can hear, even though it's a little different because of the rules of contraction and what happens to vowels and regarding when they meet up with certain consonants or vowels or whatever, and what they do and they lengthen, that this looks a whole lot like amen, doesn't it? First person plural in the present active indicative. OA say amen, amen. See, you can see it there. And ete, that looks a whole lot like second person. And this looks a whole lot like third. So they change a little bit, but you can still see the same sort of patterns emerging throughout. So while you might look at this entire chart and say, oh, that's just so much, how could I ever learn that? Remember that there's just some slight variations, that the patterns are there, and it's not like you have to learn something new every time. Just know a few of these things, like, again, the thay indicating to our passive for the aorist. Now, let's go to the future. You go to the future tense. Remember in the future tense that we talked about before, our active being just placing that sigma before the omega, so that s sound. The aorist was the saw sound. Here's the future, it's the s sound. So, seis, se, samen, sete, susen. These are all active voice. I shall lose. You shall lose. He, she, or it shall lose. We shall lose. You, as in plural, shall lose. They shall lose. All right, now, what are the forms for the middle and passive in the future? Well, in the future, they're different. The middle and passive are different from one another, so that in the middle we have somai, se, seta, sametha, sasetha, and then santai. Okay? Now, notice we already know these, don't we? See the mai, sa, ta, metha, ste, entai. So what we're looking for is if you had lu, san, tai, and you say, oh, I know lu, that's loose. That's why it's important to recognize stems, to work on your vocabulary, because the more you know about these words, then it's easier to do detective work. The more vocabulary words you have in your mind, you can see the stems, and then you know their endings, and you can get right at the root fairly quickly, because sometimes words begin to look the same, and if we pay attention, though, to the spelling of those words and our vocabulary words, then we'll be able to dissect it a little more rapidly. All right, so here are our endings again for the middle, and then we come over here to the passive. And remember, just like over here in regard to the aorist passive, these are very similar. Thane, thase, they, thamen, thete, thason. Okay? They're actually, right, identical. And so you say, well, how do I know? Again, the aorist will have the epsilon prefixed to them so that you'll know that it's past tense. So try to recognize those. It would be a good idea to commit them to memory, but just be aware of those forms and understand what we mean by passive and middle, so that when you begin to dissect a verb, when you begin to parse it and analyze it, then you'll understand what we mean by passive, middle, and you can see the forms and how they change. So look at what you've learned so far. Look how far you've come. There are a number of things here that you have been working with, and it feels good to be able to look at that and say, you know, I understand a lot of that. It's not just a bunch of, Greek letters. It's not just all Greek to you anymore. It's understandable Greek, isn't it? Okay, well, let's move on now to some other aspects of these chapters that are important as we sort of, again, preview these next chapters. And our next element that we want to talk about is the future indicative of me, the future indicative of me. Now remember, me is the to be verb. Which means in the first person, I am, or in the second person singular, you are, or in the third person singular, he, she, or it is. Okay, so those are our to be verbs. And remember that we learned that form in the present. Here is the future indicative of me, esomai, esse. It's important to say these now. Estai, esametha, esseth, esontai. Okay? Now, if you look at that carefully, you'll, and if you were to study this on page 85, you will remember that first person singular, esomai, is I will be. Esse, okay, and that should have the iota subscript. Remember we said we haven't been placing them on the screen, but there'll be a iota subscript under the eta. So esse, that will be you will be, and estai will be he will be. So those are the passive endings, that middle and passive endings that you recognize that we just discussed. My, sai, tai, metha, anti. Just recognize that we have an epsilon prefix to those, as well as the sigma, and that those will stand alone in a sentence, and you'll know to translate those accordingly. So just be aware of that particular form. Okay, so to be verbs are very important. Those me verbs, pay attention to those as you're translating those sentences, because sometimes it is implied by the sentence, other times it will be expressly stated or written. Now, let's talk about adverbs. Adverbs, that's another part of these chapters that I wanted to call your attention to. When we talk about adverbs, we're talking about another part of speech. Another part of speech. When we talk about adverbs, we're talking about another part of speech. Remember, there are several parts of speech, 8 to be precise. We've talked about nouns, we've talked about verbs, we've talked about pronouns, we've talked about adjectives, okay, just to name a few of those. Here is one more element, adverb. What do you need to know about adverbs? Well, that it's one of the 8 parts of speech. Secondly, you need to know that they describe the actions of verbs. In other words, they modify verbs. They usually answer the questions how, when, where, why, and how often or how much. For example, if you looked at these two sentences, it is appointed unto man once to die. Hebrews 9, verse 27. So what about the dying there? The once is our adverb, and it's modifying that, modifying dying. So or pointing, it's appointed unto us once is our adverb, okay, to die. Then in the next sentence, now when Herod saw Jesus, he rejoiced greatly. Rejoiced is our verb. And so greatly is our adverb. It's modifying. It's saying something about the rejoicing. What kind of rejoicing was it? Did it take place over a long time? Or was it a short period? It was a great rejoicing. He was happy to see Jesus, of course, because he wanted to see some sort of miracle, as you recall from that context. So remember that they're going to modify verbs, and they answer the question as to how, when, where, why, and how often or how much. Number 3, adverbs, they can modify adjectives, other adverbs, and whole groups of words. So they can modify adjectives and other adverbs as well. You might see a string of them together. Number 4, there are different types of adverbs. Different types of adverbs. One of the types of adverb is an adverb of manner. Notice some examples of an adverb of manner. The horse ran quickly. The horse ran slowly. The horse walked at a fast pace, and so forth. Early, badly, and well. Okay, those are adverbs of manner. Then, as another type of adverb, you have an adverb of time. An adverb of time. And those are words like today, tomorrow, yesterday, then, now, soon, recently, and always. Adverbs of time. Then there are adverbs of place. Here, there, somewhere, anywhere, and everywhere are examples of adverbs of place. All right. Then there are adverbs of degree. The words very, especially, rather, more, extremely are all adverbs. You see, they're going to add something to the verb. He loved her very much, okay, is an example of what we're talking about. So adverbs are found throughout the New Testament, numerous examples of them, and you've already learned as a part of your vocabulary class that we went over a few sessions ago some of those adverbs, and there will be more to learn as time goes by. All right, well, what are the rules for interpreting adverbs? Or number 5, what do you need to know? Other than possessing their original cases, case suffixes, adverbs are never inflected. And I almost forgot that, and that's real important that we don't forget that, because they don't change in their meaning or as far as their ending form. You know, like with the nouns, we went to os, u, o, on, and so forth. With the nouns, os, u, o, on, you have an ending. They are inflected. They change depending upon how they're functioning in the sentence. Adverbs are not inflected. Now, they follow different forms depending upon their history. So you just have to learn that adverb and what it looks like, and be able to recognize it in a sentence. Then number 6, the forms of various adverbs are diverse and must be learned by observation, what I was just mentioning a moment ago. All right, well, let's talk quickly now about the rules for interpreting adverbs as expressed by David Black. And number 1, he says that an adverb usually modifies the verb closest to it. So you're trying to figure out, well, where do I attach that adverb in the Greek sentence? It's going to modify the verb closest to it, usually. Secondly, adverbs of time and manner usually precede the word they modify. They'll usually precede the word they modify. And then number 3, adverbs of place usually follow the word they modify. They usually follow the word they modify. And you can find examples of that in various Greek grammars. So just wanted you to be aware of that when it comes to translating those adverbs. All right, now let's talk about one other element of this chapter or of these chapters that I think is very, very important, and that is understanding the use of men and de. Men and de. So that's what we're going to talk about at this point, the use of men and de. All right, in order to do that, we want to go to the board at this time. And notice over here on the board that I have written a couple of sentences with the use of men and de. Men, here's one, and de are used oftentimes in reference, or used in reference to contrast, to show a comparison and a contrast with something. And oftentimes it's best to leave it untranslated, to just see the idea of that contrast or of that comparison, to see that there. Sometimes you will translate de as just but, okay, and men will usually be untranslated. But it has the idea of on the one hand and then on the other, okay. On the one hand this is true, but on the other hand this and this is true. So from 1 Corinthians chapter 1, ego, the personal pronoun I, you see. So on the one hand, I am of Paul. In other words, some were saying, I am of Paul, but others, I am Apollos, okay. I am of Apollos. And so notice the the genitive of. So there is this sort of contrast you see there, men and de. On the one hand, some are saying this. On the other hand, some are saying the other thing. Now, sometimes when you see this men, and by the way, men and de will always be post-positive. Remember, that means it'll never stand first place in the sentence. It'll never stand first place in the sentence. It'll always come after a word in the sentence. Well, when men, and here we go down here, if we look at this sentence, de, follow articles in the plural, it's sort of best to think of it as some and others. Some and others. So that if we read this sentence, hoi men heuriskusi thanaton, hoi de ta prosopon, tu Christu blepusin. That if we translated that, here is our plural article, right? Heuriskusi, they find, okay, so here is the subject of our sentence, they find death, direct object, accusative case. Some, see, so here's our plural, some, that's where we can kind of get the plural idea. Some find death. But others, ta prosopon, tu Christu blepusin, here is our verb, third person plural, they see, okay, what are they seeing? They're seeing the face of Christ. Okay, prosopon, ta prosopon, okay, accusative, the face, genitive of Christ. So, some find death, but others see the face of Christ. It's just, again, another way of sort of showing this, comparing the two. And you'll see that men and de used in that regard. Okay, so just be aware of that. Sometimes men will be left untranslated. All right, well, that brings us to the end of this series of lessons that has to do with the middle and passive voices and other aspects of things that are important for us to know. Just wanted to make you aware of that as we sort of combine these three chapters together and this for the sake of time and to move us quickly through to some other issues. When we come back in our next session, we're going to spend some time translating some sentences in the middle and passive from these chapters to give you an idea of sort of how these things will fit together and how they work out, and to see them in action, and then also discuss with you some vocabulary words from these chapters that are important for you to know as well. So continue working hard. We appreciate your being with us in this class. We're quickly coming to an end. We don't have that many more things to talk about, believe it or not. Other things will move very quickly and rapidly now. We have just a few classes left as we move toward the completion of this class on learning to use the Greek New Testament. Thank you for being with us. May you have a great day. God bless you, and we'll see you next time.